It was 7 o'clock in the morning at City Hospital. Dr. James Chen pushed open the big glass doors and walked into the emergency room. The whole place smelled like cleaning supplies, just like it did every morning. He saw many familiar faces. The night shift nurses who had worked all night long were getting ready to go home. They looked tired but still smiled and waved at him. Dr. Chen was 35 years old and had been working at this hospital for 5 years. Everyone knew him as the doctor who always took extra time with his patients and never seemed to get angry or upset, no matter how busy things got. The other doctors and nurses liked working with him because he was very good at his job and always helped others when they needed it. He went to the staff room to get ready for his day. He put on his white doctor's coat and placed his stethoscope around his neck. Just then, Lucy, the nurse in charge of the emergency room, ran into the room. She was breathing hard, like she had been running. "Dr. Chen," Lucy said quickly, "we need your help right now. There's a very sick patient in room 4. He's having really bad chest pain and his arm feels numb. These could be signs of a heart attack." Dr. Chen quickly picked up his computer tablet that had all the patient information and followed Lucy down the long, bright hallway. When they got to room 4, Dr. Chen saw a man who looked about 50 years old sitting on the hospital bed. The man's face was very pale and sweat was running down his forehead. Signs that told Dr. Chen this was serious. The man's wife was standing next to him, holding his hand very tightly. She looked worried and scared. Dr. Chen gave them his friendly smile that always helped make patients feel better. "Hello, I'm Dr. Chen," he said in a warm, calm voice. "I'm here to help." But before he could say anything else, the wife's face changed. She didn't look worried anymore. Now she looked angry. "Can we see a different doctor?" the wife asked. She wouldn't even look at Dr. Chen. Instead, she kept looking at the door like she was hoping someone else would come in. Her husband, who was clearly in a lot of pain, looked at her with surprise and embarrassment. This wasn't the first time Dr. Chen had been treated this way. Just yesterday, he had read in the news about another Asian doctor who had been treated badly by patients just because of how he looked. The story made him think about his little daughter, who had come home from school crying last week because some kids had made fun of the Chinese food he had packed for her lunch. The wife spoke again, this time in a louder and meaner voice. "We want a real American doctor," she said. The room got very quiet after she said these harsh words. Dr. Chen could see that her husband was getting worse. His face was getting more pale and he was holding his chest tighter. Dr. Chen knew he had to do something fast. It didn't matter what the wife thought about him. What mattered was that this man might be having a heart attack, and he needed help right away. Things were about to get very interesting in room 4, and Dr. Chen knew that what he did next would be very important. Not just to prove he was a good doctor, but to save this man's life. Dr. Chen took a deep breath. He knew he had to stay calm, even though the wife's words had hurt his feelings. He looked straight at the man on the bed and spoke in a kind but firm voice. "Sir, I can see you're in a lot of pain. Can you tell me exactly how you're feeling right now?" The man, whose name was Robert Wilson, was holding his chest with both hands now. My chest feels like it's being squeezed really tight," he said, having trouble catching his breath. "And my left arm, it feels really heavy and numb. I'm also feeling very dizzy." Dr. Chen knew these were all dangerous signs of a heart attack. He had seen these symptoms many times before, and he knew there wasn't much time to waste. Even though the wife was still giving him angry looks, he quickly started doing his job. "Lucy," he called to the nurse who was standing nearby, "please get the EKG machine right away." An EKG machine was a special tool that could show if someone's heart wasn't working properly. While Lucy rushed to get the machine, Dr. Chen picked up Robert's wrist to check his pulse. It was beating very fast and not in a regular pattern. Another bad sign. "Mrs. Wilson," Dr. Chen said to the wife, trying one more time to help her understand. "I know you're worried about your husband. I went to medical school right here in the city. I've treated thousands of patients with heart problems. Right now, your husband is showing all the signs of having a serious heart attack. Every minute we waste looking for another doctor puts his life in more danger." The wife's face changed a little bit when she heard the words, heart attack. She looked at her husband, then back at Dr. Chen, and then at her husband again. She seemed torn between her prejudice against Dr. Chen and her fear for her husband's life. Just then, Robert let out a loud groan and started sliding off the bed. His eyes were rolling back in his head. Dr. Chen moved quickly, catching Robert before he could fall. Code blue! Code blue! He shouted, which was the hospital's emergency call for when a patient's heart stops beating properly. Suddenly, the small room was filled with nurses and other medical staff. They were all moving quickly, knowing exactly what to do because they had trained for situations just like this. Dr. Chen was giving clear, calm instructions to everyone like a conductor leading an orchestra. Start chest compressions. Get the crash cart in here, he ordered. The crash cart was a special cart with emergency medicines and equipment that could help restart a heart. The wife had backed into a corner of the room, her hands covering her mouth. All her anger seemed to disappear as she watched Dr. Chen and his team fighting to save her husband's life. The next few minutes would be very important. Dr. Chen knew he had to use all his medical knowledge and experience to help Robert, but he also knew that this situation was about more than just saving one person's life. It was about showing that a doctor's skill and dedication had nothing to do with what they looked like or where their family came from. The next few minutes in room 4 were like a carefully planned dance, with everyone moving quickly but carefully. Dr. Chen stood at Robert's side, leading his medical team while they worked to save Robert's life. The machines around them were making loud beeping noises, showing that Robert's heart wasn't beating normally. Charging defibrillator, called out one of the nurses. The defibrillator was a machine that could give an electric shock to help restart a heart that wasn't beating properly. Dr. Chen took the paddles, the parts of the machine that would deliver the shock, in his hands. Clear, he shouted, which meant everyone needed to step back so no one else would get shocked. When he pressed the buttons, Robert's body jumped slightly from the electric shock. Everyone stared at the heart monitor screen, waiting to see if Robert's heart would start beating normally again. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Mrs. Wilson was crying quietly in the corner, all her earlier anger completely forgotten. Please, she whispered, please save him. Dr. Chen looked at the monitor and quickly made a decision. We need to try something else, he said calmly. He asked for a special medicine that could help heart problem. He had learned about a new way to use this medicine during a medical conference last month, and he thought it might help Robert. While they waited for the medicine to work, Dr. Chen talked softly to Robert, even though Robert couldn't respond. Come on, Mr. Wilson, your family needs you. Fight with us. This was something Dr. Chen always did with his patients. He believed that sometimes people could hear even when they seemed unconscious, and that encouraging words could help them fight harder to stay alive. Suddenly, the beeping of the heart monitor changed. Everyone in the room held their breath. The irregular lines on the screen slowly started to become more regular. Robert's heart was starting to beat normally again. His color began to improve, and he started breathing more easily. We've got a normal rhythm, Dr. Chen announced, and everyone in the room let out a sigh of relief. Mrs. Wilson started crying even harder, but this time they were tears of joy and relief. She stepped forward, closer to her husband's bed, watching as he began to show signs of waking up. Dr. Chen quickly arranged for Robert to be moved to the intensive care unit, ICU, where he could be watched very carefully. As the team prepared to move Robert, Mrs. Wilson touched Dr. Chen's arm gently. Her face was very different now. All the anger was gone, replaced by shame and gratitude. Doctor, she said quietly, her voice shaking, I don't know what to say. We treated you so badly, and yet you just saved my husband's life. She wiped tears from her face with her hands. Dr. Chen could see that she was struggling with her feelings, feeling thankful but also embarrassed about how she had acted earlier. But this story wasn't over yet. What happened next would surprise everyone at the hospital and would end up teaching a lesson that would reach far beyond the walls of room 4. Later that evening, after Robert had been moved to the ICU and was resting comfortably, Dr. Chen was sitting at the nurse's station filling out paperwork. He always wrote detailed notes about his patients so other doctors would know exactly what had happened. His shift had ended 2 hours ago, but he wanted to make sure everything was properly taken care of before he went home. And then, while he was writing, he heard someone clear their throat behind him. When he turned around, he saw Mrs. Wilson standing there. She looked very different from the angry woman he had met that morning. Her shoulders were slouched and her eyes were red from crying. Dr. Chen, she said softly, could I talk to you for a minute? She was holding a cup of coffee in her shaking hands. Dr. Chen nodded and guided her to some nearby chairs where they could talk privately. "I've been sitting with Robert in the ICU," she began, looking down at her coffee cup. "He's awake now and he's doing so much better. The ICU nurses told me that if you hadn't acted so quickly this morning," her voice broke a little, "if you hadn't known exactly what to do, Robert wouldn't be alive right now." Dr. Chen listened quietly as she continued talking. "I keep thinking about how I acted this morning," she said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I was so wrong, so terribly wrong. I grew up in a small town where we didn't have many people who looked different from us. I never thought I was prejudiced, but today showed me that I had some really ugly thoughts in my head." She took a deep breath and looked directly at Dr. Chen. "My grandfather died of a heart attack when I was young," she explained. "The doctor who treated him was new to our town and seemed unsure of what to do. Ever since then, I've been scared of trusting doctors I don't know. But that's no excuse for how I treated you." Just then, a young medical student named Jenny walked by. She was Asian American like Dr. Chen, and she had been watching him work all week as part of her training. Mrs. Wilson saw her and called her over. "Are you training to be a doctor too?" Mrs. Wilson asked Jenny. When Jenny nodded, Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears again. "I want you to know something. What happened this morning with Dr. Chen, how I treated him, that was wrong. I hope you never have to face what he faced today. A good doctor is a good doctor, no matter what they look like." Jenny looked surprised but touched by Mrs. Wilson's words. Dr. Chen felt something powerful happening in that moment. It wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, something that could help change how people think and act. But what Mrs. Wilson did next would take this story in an unexpected direction, reaching far more people than anyone could have imagined. The next morning, when Dr. Chen checked his phone during his coffee break, he was surprised to see that one of his friends had sent him a link to a Facebook post. "You need to see this," the message said. When he clicked on the link, he was even more surprised to see Mrs. Wilson's name and a long post she had written late the previous night. The post started with a photo of Robert sleeping peacefully in his hospital bed. Next to it, Mrs. Wilson had written, "Yesterday, I almost lost my husband because of my own prejudice. I need to share this story because I'm ashamed of what I did, but proud of the doctor who saved my husband's life despite how badly I treated him." She went on to tell the whole story in detail. She wrote about how she had asked for a different doctor just because Dr. Chen was Asian. She described how calm and professional he had remained, even when she was being rude. She explained how quickly and skillfully he had worked when Robert's heart stopped beating, and how he had tried a special new treatment that ended up saving Robert's life. "This doctor could have walked away," she wrote. "He could have said, fine, wait for another doctor. But he didn't. He stayed and fought for my husband's life, as if Robert was his own family member. And here's what I learned. When you're lying there watching someone you love dying, you don't care what your doctor looks like. You only care that they know how to save the person you love." The post was already getting lots of attention. By lunchtime, it had been shared more than 10,000 times. People from all over the country were commenting and sharing their own stories. Many Asian healthcare workers wrote about similar experiences they had faced. Other people shared stories about times when they had judged someone unfairly and learned important lessons. A local news reporter saw the post and called the hospital, asking to interview Dr. Chen and the Wilsons. At first, Dr. Chen wasn't sure about doing an interview. He was a quiet person who didn't like being the center of attention. But then he thought about his daughter who had been teased at school for bringing Chinese food for lunch. He thought about Jenny, the medical student, and all the other young Asian Americans who wanted to become doctors. Maybe, he thought, this story could help make things a little better for them. But before he could decide about the interview, something unexpected happened that would make this story even more powerful. Some of the comments on Mrs. Wilson's post were from people who had been Dr. Chen's patients before. They started sharing their own stories about how he had helped them. One person wrote about how Dr. Chen had spent extra time explaining things to their elderly mother who was confused and scared. Another told about how he had come in on his day off to check on their child who was in the hospital. All these stories were painting a picture of a doctor who was kind, caring, and skilled. A doctor who just happened to be Asian American. The story was becoming about much more than one incident in an emergency room. It was turning into something that would change how many people thought about prejudice in healthcare. 3 days later, Robert was doing much better and was moved from the ICU to a regular hospital room. That morning, Dr. Chen went to check on him as usual. When he walked into the room, he found Robert sitting up in bed, looking at his phone and laughing. "Dr. Chen," Robert said with a big smile, "did you know my wife's Facebook post has now been shared more than 100,000 times? There are people writing about it from all over the world." Robert's voice was stronger now, and his face had much more color than it had a few days ago. Mrs. Wilson was sitting in a chair next to the bed, also looking at her phone. "Doctor, you won't believe this," she said excitedly. "A famous talk show host just sent me a message. They want us to come on their show and tell our story. They said stories like this are important right now because there's been a lot of unfair treatment of Asian Americans lately." Dr. Chen checked Robert's heart rate and blood pressure while listening to them talk. Everything looked good. Robert was recovering well. While Dr. Chen was writing notes in Robert's chart, a nurse came into the room with some surprising news. "Dr. Chen," the nurse said, "there's a group of Asian American medical students in the waiting room. They heard about what happened, and they've come to meet you. They say your story has given them hope about becoming doctors, even though they're worried about facing prejudice themselves." Just then, Dr. Chen's phone buzzed. It was a message from his daughter's school principal. The principal wrote that after hearing about Dr. Chen's story, they had decided to start a new program at school. They would teach children about different cultures and how to respect everyone, no matter where their families came from. They wanted Dr. Chen to come speak to the students about his experiences. Mrs. Wilson listened to all this news and started crying again, but this time they were happy tears. "Look at all the good that's coming from my terrible mistake," she said. "I never thought my apology would reach so many people." Robert reached over and held his wife's hand. "You know what?" he said. "Sometimes the best way to fix a mistake is to admit it publicly and help others learn from it." He turned to Dr. Chen. "And sometimes the best way to fight prejudice is to show kindness to people even when they don't deserve it. Just like you did with us, Doctor." Dr. Chen felt touched by their words, but he also felt a big responsibility growing. More and more people were looking up to him now. They wanted him to speak about his experiences and help make changes in how people treat each other. It was a bit scary, but he knew something important was happening. But the biggest surprise was still to come. Something that would take this story from a viral social media post to a movement that would change many lives, including Dr. Chen's own. A week after Robert left the hospital, Dr. Chen was working his usual morning shift when Lucy, the head nurse, came running up to him again. This time, she was holding a newspaper in her hands, and she looked very excited. "Dr. Chen, you're on the front page," she said, showing him the newspaper. Sure enough, there was a big picture of him in his white coat, and the headline read, "Local Doctor Story Starts National Conversation About Racism in Healthcare." The article told the whole story from the moment Mrs. Wilson had asked for a different doctor to how her Facebook post had gone viral. But there was more. The newspaper reported that because of this story, several big hospitals across the country had decided to start new training programs. These programs would teach all hospital workers how to be more understanding of people from different backgrounds. While Dr. Chen was reading the article, his phone rang. It was from a group called Doctors for Equality. They explained that they had created a scholarship fund in his name. The Dr. James Chen Scholarship would help Asian American students who wanted to become doctors but didn't have enough money for medical school. "We've already raised $100,000, the caller said. "Your story has inspired many people to donate. They want to help make sure that other young people like you can become doctors too, no matter what challenges they face." Dr. Chen had to sit down for a moment. He thought about his own struggles when he was trying to become a doctor. His parents had worked extra jobs to help pay for his medical school. Now, because of what happened with the Wilsons, other students would have an easier path. Later that day, during his lunch break, Dr. Chen walked down to the hospital cafeteria. As soon as he entered, something unusual happened. Everyone in the cafeteria, doctors, nurses, cleaning staff, and visitors, started clapping. They had all read the newspaper article too. Among the people clapping was Jenny, the medical student who had witnessed Mrs. Wilson's apology. She was smiling with tears in her eyes. Next to her were 5 other Asian American medical students who had come to the hospital just to meet Dr. Chen. You've changed things for us, Jenny said. Yesterday, a patient who reminded me of Mrs. Wilson started to say something about wanting a different doctor, but then she stopped herself and said she had read about you. She apologized and said she was trying to do better. Just then, Dr. Chen's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from his daughter's teacher. The teacher sent a photo of his daughter standing proudly in front of her class, holding her lunchbox filled with Chinese food. Under the photo, the teacher had written, "Today, your daughter taught her classmates about Chinese culture. The same kids who used to tease her about her lunch are now asking if they can try some." But even with all these amazing changes happening, there was still one more surprise coming. Something that would take this story of forgiveness and understanding to an even bigger stage. The next big surprise came on a quiet Sunday morning. Dr. Chen was at home helping his daughter with her homework when his phone started ringing nonstop. Friends and family were sending him messages telling him to turn on the TV right away. When he did, he couldn't believe what he saw. Mrs. Wilson was on a famous morning news show talking to millions of viewers across the country. She was sitting next to Robert, who looked healthy and strong now. They were sharing their story, but they were saying something new that Dr. Chen hadn't heard before. "After Dr. Chen saved my husband's life," Mrs. Wilson said on TV, wiping tears from her eyes, "we decided we needed to do more than just apologize on Facebook. So we've sold our small business and we're using the money to start a new organization called Hearts Without Hate." The TV host asked her to explain what this organization would do. Mrs. Wilson smiled and said, "We're going to visit schools and hospitals all over the country. We'll tell our story and teach people about how prejudice can hurt everyone. And the best part is, Dr. Chen has agreed to join us sometimes to help share this message." Dr. Chen's daughter looked up at him with big eyes. "Daddy, did you really agree to do that?" she asked. Dr. Chen laughed. This was the first he'd heard about it, but as he thought about it, he realized it was actually a wonderful idea. The TV show then showed clips of people reacting to the Wilsons' original Facebook post. There were comments from people all over the world. Some were crying as they talked about similar experiences they'd had. Others admitted that they too had judged people unfairly and wanted to change. One clip showed a group of young Asian American children standing in front of their school. They were holding signs that said, "Thank you, Dr. Chen," and "We want to be doctors too." Their teacher explained that after hearing Dr. Chen's story, none of the children were being teased anymore about their lunches or how they looked. The TV host then announced something even bigger. A famous filmmaker wanted to make a movie about what happened in room 4 that day. They wanted to show how one moment of crisis and forgiveness could start a chain reaction of positive changes across the country. Dr. Chen's daughter jumped up and down with excitement. "Daddy, you're going to be in a movie!" she shouted. But then she got quiet and asked a serious question. "Do you think Mrs. Wilson was really sorry for what she did?" Just then, Dr. Chen's phone buzzed with a message that would answer his daughter's question in an unexpected way. The message on Dr. Chen's phone was from Mrs. Wilson. She had sent him a video that she wanted him to see before anyone else. In the video, she was standing in front of her old high school in her small hometown. The whole school, over 500 students and teachers, was gathered behind her. "Dr. Chen," she said in the video, "I wanted you to see this first. Today, I came back to my old school, where I first learned some of my wrong ideas about people who are different from me. But today, we're making a big change." The camera moved to show a big sign being unveiled on the school building. It read, "The Dr. James Chen Center for Cultural Understanding." Mrs. Wilson explained that her old high school would now have special classes teaching students about different cultures, races, and traditions. "And that's not all," Mrs. Wilson continued in the video. "Remember how I told you my grandfather died of a heart attack? Well, we've also started a special program at this school. Any student who wants to become a doctor, no matter what they look like or where their family comes from, will get help preparing for medical school." Dr. Chen's daughter watched the video with her father. "See, Daddy," she said, "she really is sorry. She's trying to fix things for everyone, not just for us." Later that day at the hospital, Dr. Chen had another surprise. The hospital director called him into her office. She told him that because of his story, the hospital was making changes too. They were going to start giving special training to all doctors and nurses about how to handle situations where patients show prejudice. And we want you to help lead this training, the director said. Your story shows that sometimes the best way to fight prejudice is not with anger, but with kindness and excellent medical care. While Dr. Chen was in this meeting, something amazing was happening in the emergency room. A young Asian American doctor was treating a patient who started making racist comments. But before anyone could react, another patient in the next bed spoke up. "Hey," the other patient said, "have you heard about Dr. Chen? You should read his story. It might change how you think about things." The first patient got quiet, pulled out their phone, and started reading the story that had now been shared millions of times. That evening, as Dr. Chen was getting ready to go home, Jenny, the medical student, came to find him. She had tears in her eyes but was smiling. "Dr. Chen," she said, "I just got accepted to work at this hospital after I graduate. And you know what? The hospital director said they've had more Asian American medical students apply here in the last month than in the whole past year. But even with all these wonderful changes, there was still one more thing that needed to happen. Something that would bring the whole story full circle and touch everyone's hearts in an unexpected way." 1 month after everything started, Dr. Chen stood in front of a large crowd in the hospital's main meeting room. It was a special day. The hospital was launching its new training program about treating all patients with respect, and hundreds of people had come to watch. Robert and Mrs. Wilson were there too, sitting in the front row. Robert looked healthy and strong now, very different from that scary morning in room 4. Mrs. Wilson was holding a big envelope in her hands, and she kept smiling at Dr. Chen like she had a happy secret. When it was time for Dr. Chen to speak, he started telling the story of that morning in room 4. But suddenly Mrs. Wilson stood up and politely interrupted him. "Dr. Chen," she said, "before you continue, we have something to show you." She opened the big envelope and pulled out hundreds of letters. "These," she explained, her voice shaking with emotion, "are letters from people all over the country. They're all addressed to you." She handed him one letter to read out loud. Dr. Chen opened the letter and started reading. "Dear Dr. Chen, I am a 12-year-old Asian American girl. I used to be embarrassed about being different, but after reading your story, I'm proud of who I am. I've decided I want to be a doctor just like you. Thank you for showing me that I can do anything, no matter what people say." There were many more letters just like this one. Some were from other doctors who had faced similar problems. Others were from people who admitted they used to think like Mrs. Wilson, but had changed their minds after hearing the story. Many were from children of all backgrounds who now wanted to become doctors. Then something unexpected happened. The door opened, and Dr. Chen's daughter walked in with her whole class behind her. They were all carrying lunch boxes filled with food from different cultures: Chinese, Indian, Mexican, Italian, and more. "We're having a friendship lunch," his daughter announced proudly. "Everyone brought food to share, and no one is making fun of anyone anymore." Mrs. Wilson walked up to Dr. Chen's daughter and gave her a gentle hug. "You know," she said to everyone in the room, "sometimes it takes a child to show us how simple it really is to accept each other." Dr. Chen looked around the room. There was Robert, alive and well because medicine and kindness had proven stronger than prejudice. There was Jenny, now confidently wearing her white coat as she prepared to become a doctor. There were the letters from hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by this story. And there was his daughter, no longer afraid to be herself at school. "You know what the best medicine really is?" Dr. Chen asked the crowd. "It's not just the pills we give or the surgeries we do. Sometimes the best medicine is showing kindness to those who don't expect it, teaching others through our actions and being proud of who we are." As everyone in the room stood up and clapped, Dr. Chen realized that what had started as one difficult morning in room 4 had turned into something much bigger. It had become a lesson about how one person's kindness, even in the face of prejudice, could help change many hearts and minds. After all, he thought as he watched his daughter sharing her Chinese lunch with Mrs. Wilson, sometimes the people who start out as our biggest critics can end up being our strongest supporters. All it takes is an open heart and a willingness to change.